How are we doing at the back? Can people hear me up the back? Excellent, excellent. Welcome, everyone. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to Politics in the Pub. Thanks for coming along this evening. I want to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and pay my respects to elders past and present. I also want to extend a welcome to any Aboriginal people in the audience this evening, or indeed watching us on the live stream. Thanks for coming along this evening. Because we're showing a bit of a doco this evening, we have taken the liberty of queuing up another video to play for you as well, which I'll get to in just a second. But I did just want to thank everyone for coming along this evening. I know we talk about this a lot, but we really love hosting Politics in the Pub. We think it's a really great way to get public policy out into the public debate and make a lot of the research that we do accessible to the public and ways for you to engage with it and ask questions and things. So we really appreciate that you all come along every month. Yeah, give yourselves a round of applause. Thanks so much. I think it's a really important part of how people stay connected to our democracy. So how things are going to run this evening is I'm going to play you a short video from the Australia Institute about what we've been doing in the last kind of year or so that we've pulled together that we'd love for you to see as some of our strongest and most regular supporters that come out to Politics in the Pub regularly. Then I'm going to do a bit of an introduction of the documentary and Stephen Long, my colleague who made it. But I actually am going to come and sit down and watch the doco down there in the audience with all of you, so I can get to see it along with you guys. And then we'll bring Stephen up for a discussion and some questions. So without further ado, Hannah, if you could play the thank you video, please.
I think it's very important to have a think tank, a group, looking at the overarching principles. One of the things that makes it special is that it encompasses all the issues confronting Australia.
The Australia Institute, it's revealed that 2/3 of people in this country believe corruption is common.
The Australia Institute shows 90% support for rules around truth in political advertising.
Well, more than half of the gas exported from Australia is royalty-free, according to research from think tank the Australia Institute.
The Australia Institute.
The Australia Institute.
The Australia Institute.
If we collect more tax and lower the price of energy, lower the price of medicine, lower the price of childcare, lower the price of going to the doctor, you know what we'll do? We'll lower inflation.
The question isn't whether Australia has the capacity to lead with integrity. The question is whether the people in this building have the courage to do it.
Poverty is a policy choice. These are things that can be addressed. We know how to do them.
I and others would argue that actually more often than not Australia's relationship with the United States makes us less safe.
This great submarine deal is almost certainly going to result in us having no submarines. It's a terrible, terrible mistake.
Government has to change its view.
Destruction of native forests.
Australia is one of the biggest consumers of fashion per capita in the world.
Climate integrity.
The Whistleblower Protection Authority.
Record profits and price gouging.
90% of Australians are saying, we think this is a good idea. Our parliament could do its job.
To have institutions like the Australia Institute doing original research that underpins the arguments of those who want to reconstitute the dream of democracy, that is the greatest gift to anyone who wants to keep the idea of democracy alive.
Thanks very much, everyone. Those were just kind of some of the highlights of the past year or so at the Australia Institute, including, as you saw, some of the guests we brought out as part of our 30th anniversary celebrations. And I guess, want to reiterate that we really do feel like we couldn't do what we do without supporters like you guys who come out to the events we put on, who are interested in hearing from the public policy experts that we host here, and who really try and engage with our democracy and with public policy. We absolutely couldn't do it without you. So I am really excited that you've all come out this evening for this documentary that we're about to show you. I'm going to introduce Stephen Long, then we'll watch the video and we'll both come back up together to have a bit of a discussion. But many of you will be familiar with Stephen Long's work. He's the Senior Fellow and Contributing Editor at the Australia Institute now, but you will probably remember him as a Walkley Award winning senior reporter and journalist for the ABC's flagship investigative journalism program, Four Corners. He's also been an economics correspondent and a national finance correspondent, filing across nearly all ABC outlets. And Stephen and my colleague, Eleanor Johnson-Leake, pulled together this video, and they went out to Western Australia, to Murujuga, to film this, because the Australia Institute's been working on Australia's gas problems and the gas export issue that we have created for ourselves. And one of the things that we don't necessarily think about, the Australia Institute does a lot of work on the economics of gas, on the climate impacts of gas, but it has bigger and worse implications for our country than just that. And the threat that it poses to the ancient rock art at Murujuga is one of the most important examples of that. So before we kind of dive into questions, we're going to show you this incredible video report put together, the cinematography and editing by Eleanor, and who's senior content producer at the Australia Institute, and Stephen pulling together the report for us overall. The rock art that you're about to see is tens of thousands of years old. The rock engravings are on Western Australia's Dampier Archipelago in the Pilbara region. They're irreplaceable, essentially. Hands up if you remember when a fossil fuel company blew up Juukan Caves and Gorge. Yeah. So losing the rock art at Murujuga would be a cultural loss on a scale as bad, if not worse than that. And it's not too late to save it, but it is at risk. They're twice as old as France's Lascaux cave paintings and 8 times older than the pyramids. It's nationally heritage listed and has been recognised by UNESCO for its World Heritage value as well, but it is facing destruction and it doesn't need to be. That's what you're going to watch here this evening, and then when I get back up here, I'll bring Stephen with me and we'll have a bit of a discussion about what he saw and experienced at Murujuga and what's at stake. Thanks very much.
You guys look...
The rock art is remarkable, and it shows and tells the songlines. It carries an ancient storyline. It depicts and tells a story and history of our people.
Near Dampier, in the far northwest of Australia, is a vast outdoor art gallery. The ancient Aboriginal rock art of Murujuga is extraordinary and unique.
I'm president of the International Scientific Committee on Rock Art, and for me, this is the most important rock art site in the world. This is an art that goes back 50,000 years with extinct animals and the world's oldest depictions of the human face. Murujuga has more than 1 million rock art images, the largest number of images of any site.
Nowhere else in the world has this density, and it is just sitting there on the surface, highly visible. It is an anathema to think you could place industry within a landscape like that.
Yet incredibly, amid the rock art, governments have allowed rampant industrial development here. The oil and gas giant Woodside is at the centre of a petrochemical hub that threatens the rock art's very survival.
I'm Dr. Ken Mulvaney, I'm a resident of Dampier. I've been recording the rock art here basically on and off for 45 years.
We have this animal, it's splayed out, there's the body, tail and legs going out.
Archaeologist and anthropologist Dr. Ken Mulvaney has documented different phases of the rock art over time. For decades, he's been fighting to save these ancient petroglyphs.
When I first came and here working for the West Australian Museum, we were employed to survey in front of the bulldozers that were levelling an area to make way for the Karratha gas plant at the time. Back in the late 70s, early 80s, people didn't realise or appreciate just how important, how dense this cultural landscape was in terms of its art, its archaeology, its Aboriginal importance. But 10 years, 20 years later, we knew it. I was expecting there would be no more industrial development here because we knew then just how unique and culturally important this place was.
But if Dr. Mulvaney thought the presence of the priceless ancient rock art would stop development, he was mistaken.
In the time I've been here, I've seen 5 major developments go ahead. We have some companies that insist, and Woodside is amongst them, who insist that they want this as a gas hub, the largest petrochemical development in the Southern Hemisphere, in a place that they knew was so culturally significant, and everything they do does have an impact on that cultural heritage. It's not just the footprint of that development, it's the impact, the audio impact, the flares going, the noise from the industry. But worse than that is the question of the emissions, the industrial emissions that are pouring out of these plants, that are settling on the rock surfaces.
Gas burnt in the plants is creating emissions that make the rock surfaces acidic. This could eat away the natural varnish, protecting the images etched into the stone.
So for 50,000 years, the rocks have remained stable in an environment that has preserved them. But over the last 40 years, that industrial development has increased the emissions load that has altered the pH from alkaline to acidic. And by doing that, it is destroying the rock art.
At the University of WA, they've captured images of the rock art before the gas and chemical plants were built and rephotographed them today. The before and after images paint a bleak picture.
So we've digitised over 1,000 images, and what those images show is that from the 1970s to 2025 we can see a discernible fading in those surfaces, so they're getting paler.
Professor Ben Smith and fellow researchers also tested how the acid fallout affects the rock.
So we have extensive laboratory evidence that shows that the pollutants that are coming out of those Woodside stacks are actively degrading the rock art surfaces. Over in Germany, in a very fancy lab in Bonn, we did sort of climate experiments where we take actual pieces of rock still in their solid state and then put them in a climate chamber where you're simulating both the pollution and simulating the rain and also simulating sun and heat. And then you speed up time so that what we can see is what happens to those rocks over a 6-year period. So we've modelled the degradation of those rocks under current pollution conditions in a lab for 6 years, and we can see radical change in those rocks.
How certain is that evidence?
So it's absolute, it's incontestable.
A welcome to country for special guests. Fiona Hall is a photographer and sculptor known for her multimedia installations. Tracy Moffat is a photo artist and filmmaker renowned worldwide.
Hi. How are you going? Good to see you.
They're joined by traditional custodian Raylene Cooper from the group Save Our Songlines and Esther Montgomery. They're fighting further development at Murujuga.
People look at the Mona Lisa as something really incredible. This is a Mona Lisa, but it's on a natural landscape. That's the canvas. This is the beauty of it. When you look at the rock art here, it's telling our story. This is our Bible, this is our cathedral, and this is who we are. The song lines come from these stories, the rock art.
What would it mean for you and your people if the rock art was to be destroyed?
Oh, look, it's hard to put into words, it really is. It'd be like, how can I put this? It'd be like in Metro Sydney, the Sydney Opera House being blown to smithereens.
The artists spend days viewing the ancient art.
The art that people had here. We don't know. Sloping rock, the fish is pointing to the...
I think it is absolutely stunning. The petroglyphs are like treasures. They're like rivulets of gold throughout the rocks, flowing over the rocks, and then, you know, discovering this one and that one, and at first you think, no, there's nothing there, and then you look close, and there's the fish, and there's the geometric pattern, and there's the woman figure with the spear, and so on. It goes on and on. We are looking at mountains of it, and it just must be saved. I mean, the thought of this horror landscape of this industry that's going to be expanded, to think that they're going to build even more, it makes me want to cry.
I feel that the drive for creativity is a shared force across time, across cultures, across whatever age you are, and across disciplines as well.
And how do you rank the rock art in that schema?
Very, very highly. And a space like this should be able to exist for eons into the future, as is, with no intervention or destructive activity.
The great tragedy is the gas plants and the petrochemical hub that feeds on the gas don't need to be at Murujuga.
The gas is offshore along our continental shelf, 100 kilometres from here at the closest. Some of the gas they're wanting to ship in is 800 kilometres from here. Industry can go anywhere and still process those resources. They don't have to be here.
The rock art has already been damaged by industrial pollution, according to a report the WA government buried for a year. It shows rock surfaces near industry at Dampier are porous.
What that means is if you look at it under a microscope, it kind of looks like a Swiss cheese.
When it was finally released, the report exempted Woodside and blamed historic emissions from an old power station. Yet when Professor Smith read its 800 pages, he found graphs and data buried in the report that contradict that claim.
Their own figures on page 633 show that that's not the case. Their own statistics that are in the report. That Dampier power plant emitted just a quarter of the emissions that are currently being emitted by industry on Murujuga. 13,000 tonnes of nitrous oxides are being emitted at Murujuga every year. And it's those emissions that are causing the damage we're seeing, the increased porosity of those rock surfaces.
Then came the decision people feared. Without even visiting the site, Environment Minister Murray Watt approved a 50-year extension of the North West Shelf gas development for Woodside. He says there are strict conditions to protect the rock art, but they haven't been made public, and whether they're adequate remains to be seen.
50 years, it's enough time to lose a significant portion of the Murujuga rock art at current levels of pollution.
Even if Woodside can mitigate the impact of emissions on the rock art, its gas expansion is a massive carbon bomb that will unleash billions of tonnes of greenhouse gases.
Our whales, our dreaming stories, our turtles, these song lines belong to everybody.
Raylene Cooper sees a parallel between what's happening at Murujuga and Rio Tinto's destruction of Indigenous rock art at Jukan Gorge.
They promised that this would never happen again. Murujuga more than 1 million rock art engravings that are being continually destroyed.
This is a preventable disaster that is happening. It's a Juukan Gorge in slow motion that we're watching happening, and that we could stop at any point if we had the political will to do it. It makes me very angry, but it makes me determined to carry on and make sure we do something about this.
We would not accept in Australia an oil rig placed inside the barrier reef. A petrochemical plant sat next to Uluru. But for some reason, on the far west of Australia, it's all right for industrial development to destroy cultural heritage. This is Juukan Gorge 1,000 times over, and 1,000 times over decades. It is just wrong.
Yeah, a round of applause to Stephen and Eleanor who put that together. It's an incredible, document of what exactly is happening there on the other side of the country that really seems like is just out of sight, out of mind. Stephen, I know you've been talking a lot about this, but can you just take us back to when you originally went to Murujuga and tell us your overall impressions when you arrived?
Well, aside from the beauty and the enormous concentration and sheer volume of the rock art there, which is really breathtaking, what really struck me was the proximity of the industry to the rock art. It deeply shocked me. I'd seen images of the rock art, a lot of them, but I didn't realize quite how close the industry was to sites that are, well, basically there's rock art everywhere, but these major sites of rock art, you've got the gas plant just nearby, and now these new petrochemical plants that they've allowed to be built right near huge concentrations of highly significant rock art. And to my mind, it really is a desecration. It says so much about our history that we allowed this, Ebony, to begin with, that we actually allowed, with the knowledge, as Ken said, back when we didn't know that the rock art was there or significance, but by the 1980s, when they did, the fact that they allowed this to go ahead, 5,000 or thereabouts petroglyphs were destroyed to make way for Woodside's gas plant. But since then, the fact that up until 2 years ago, we were still removing rock art and allowing it to be built in such close proximity, it's deeply shocking. I don't think it should ever have been allowed to happen. And I don't believe we should be looking at a continuation of that industry by extending the Northwest Shelf gas plant.
Yeah, because Ken Mulvaney made a really good point in the doco there that obviously you pointed out the carbon implications of such a massive expansion of the Northwest Shelf gas development. But his point is it doesn't need to be there. Why is it there?
No, there is no gas at Murujuga. They're bringing in the gas from hundreds of kilometres away, and they're going to be bringing it in from a huge distance now as they draw on offshore gas reserves for the extension. And it's just a historical accident that there was a port built there, so for iron ore, so it was convenient to establish the gas there, but no actual need. It's not like the gas is there, and
leaving aside the fact that from a climate change point of view, we should not be creating a massive export gas cultural landscape, and this highly significant from the point of view of Indigenous people, from a world archaeological and historical point of view. It just doesn't, it's just not right.
Yeah, I mean, Raylene and Esther made the point about it being the history of their people, but it's even bigger than that. It's a history of human civilization on Earth.
Well, the images really chart the interaction of people with the landscape and a changing landscape over tens of thousands of years. So a lot of the rock art now is actually underwater because of the changes in that landscape, but it depicts megafauna that used to roam Australia in prehistoric times, giant megafauna, and the most recent images come up to depict an image of a European ship. And so that was before the Indigenous people in the area got wiped out through colonisation and massacred. But yeah, it is just extraordinary to have a record etched into the rock that depicts such a long period of history.
And they drew those obvious connections with Juukan Gorge that Rio Tinto blew up, which did really, I mean, it brought about worldwide condemnation for that action. This is kind of more of a slow death, I guess. Is that the reason that you think it's been allowed to continue, because it's not just one big explosion?
I think there's a lot of ignorance about that. Even up until recently on the East Coast, a lot of people didn't really know that much about this. So that's number one reason. But secondly, yes, you don't have a dramatic event like Juukan Gorge where it was blown up. I think Ben Smith used the term a Juukan Gorge in slow motion. And I do think that that's part of it. And then, of course, we have the denial from Woodside and now even scientists who have been commissioned by the West Australian government that there's a problem. So, yeah.
I want to touch now on the decision to extend the Northwest Shelf project. So the Environment Minister, Murray Watt, said that he would impose strict conditions on Woodside. What do we actually know about what those conditions are of the approval, or specific to Woodside or anything?
Zero. We know nothing about what the conditions are. We only have the assurance from the Minister that he intends to impose strict conditions, and there were strict conditions in a preliminary or provisional approval. We were told at the time, I rang his office and was told that they wouldn't be made public for 10 days because Woodside, as the proponent of the Northwest Shelf Gas Extension project, out of procedural fairness, would be given 10 days to respond. Now, I don't agree with that. I think that it should have been published what the finding, what the judgment of the minister was, and what all those strict conditions were, so that experts could assess them to see whether they were adequate, whether they would actually protect the rock art. But even if you accept this idea that out of procedural fairness, Woodside Energy should have had 10 days before anything was made public, we're now months on, and it's all going on in secret. Now, call me a cynic, but I think maybe Woodside is negotiating on these strict conditions, and there's a fair chance that they may be watered down without us being any the wiser. And if you look at that process, Ebony, why isn't it the case that there's strict conditions announced, Woodside's given 10 days to respond, and if within those 10 days it doesn't feel that it can sustain its development, that it won't make enough money or whatever, with the strict conditions, why isn't it Woodside saying, well, thank you, but we're not going to go ahead? No, we've got a secretive process where clearly there's negotiations going on to basically gut the conditions, and we may never find out what the original conditions were. In a democracy, to me, this is scandalous. How can this be? Labor government came into power, and I think a lot of people had high hopes about probity, about integrity, and this is a big disappointment.
Yeah, and I also want to pick up on, it really has struck me watching it, I think, for the third or fourth time now, the concerns that the scientists raised about the other government report that was buried, and more or less what that showed and how it was changed, or certain elements of it were buried to make the case stronger, I guess, for the Northwest Shelf and for the continuing industrialization there. Can you tell us a little bit more about what we know about that process and what the scientists located, that they were really concerned about in that report?
Well, there are a number of things. The chief statistician for the report came out, and he didn't actually come out publicly in the media, but he sent emails that were leaked, and the ABC got hold of them. And he was very annoyed because in a summary of the report, there was a table, and the original table had shown a line down the bottom, which was effectively an early warning sign of concern about the level of industrial pollution and potential to damage the rock art. And in the summary, and I've been a journalist, and when journalists are facing tight deadlines and they've got to get the news out, they're not going to read the 800-page report. They're going to read the summary document. In the summary document, that line was removed, and that hid the fact that several of the stations they'd looked at with rock art were actually already above that warning sign level. So that was clear political interference in the process. But the report itself has, Ben Smith, who heads the International Rock Art Association and knows more about this than just about anyone, apart from perhaps Ken and some of the Indigenous elders. He makes the point that there's more holes in this report than Swiss. It's got holes in it like Swiss cheese, just as the rock art does. And first finding, what this report shows is there is an extensive area between Dampier and down to just past where the export gas platform and gas plant are, where the rock surfaces have become porous. They are damaged. This is really, really worrying. It actually potentially means that despite the World Heritage listing, because that surface of the rock has a natural varnish which protects the rock and has done for tens of thousands of years, the holes in that, the microscopic holes, actually mean we may lose the rock art within decades already. The finding that attributed this to historical emissions from a gas plant and not Woodside, as is pointed out, was contradicted by the data in their own report, which shows that current industry emits more. Now, we had discussions with a lobbyist who said to us, "Oh, your work wasn't accurate because of that." And we pointed out the problems in the report, and they said, "Oh, yes, but it's additive to other emissions." Well, it was a sleepy little town, Dampier, at the time, and the only industry of significance back when these historic emissions that allegedly the cause of all the damage took place was iron ore shipments. And yes, there was a lot of sulphur burnt in those ships, which can cause problems for the rock art, but the volumes were tiny compared to more recent times. And so it just doesn't bear scrutiny. They found that the surfaces of the rock art, of the rocks that bear the rock art, on most of their inspections were acidic, and yet they downplayed that finding because they said there was no acid rain. Well, you don't need acid rain. You get those acidic surfaces and you get dew on them, and it degrades the surfaces that protect the rock art. And it's just bizarre. But to me, even if these scientists genuinely believe, the imperative for this report was to find that industry could coexist with the rock art to allow the Woodside plant to go ahead and the World Heritage listing to go ahead, despite the threat that Woodside poses.
So is it a real prospect now with the Northwest Shelf being approved, that this rock art has survived and tracked human civilization for 50,000 years, and we could be in danger of losing it in the next 50.
It is. It is a real prospect that we could lose the rock art because of the damage already to the rock, but also the continuation of industrial pollution. Now,
and presumably that will accelerate with this new, so whatever it's been more intense in recent decades, and now it's going to be more intense still. Would that be accurate?
Well, Ebony, the catch-22 situation we're in here is we don't know, because we don't know what conditions the minister will actually end up imposing. However, if the emissions that continue as they have, there is a large body of scientific evidence that shows that they will damage the rock art, continue to damage the rock art. Now, Woodside incredibly responded to suggestions that they put in technology to get rid of some of the industrial pollutants, and it would have reduced their profit margin by about 3% a year, said there wasn't sufficient cost benefit, too expensive. Other scientists have suggested that some scientists have said, well, this could be solved by electrifying the plants, because what's causing the problem is that in order to liquefy gas to export, they're burning large quantities of gas there. They're also using it in the petrochemical plants, but they're burning large quantities of gas to liquefy gas to export. Now, that process could be electrified, but it would be expensive. But again, Woodside doesn't want to do that because they don't want to have to spend the money. But to me, that's not an adequate response, though, Ebony, because electrification would mean more industrial development up there, and the industrial development itself is a travesty. What really, I believe, should be happening is they should be saying, no gas extension, we close down the existing industry. But still, it would be really interesting to know if the minister was actually seriously recommending things that would stop the industrial pollutants that are causing the problem, and whether that's why Woodside has gone, no way, Jose.
Yeah.
We need to have a long talk about this in secret. And and if your government doesn't want a big campaign by the gas industry, this needs to be fixed.
Yeah. We're going to come to questions from the audience in just a second. We've got a microphone just here. If you've got a question for Stephen, if you want to start lining up now, that would be fantastic. Stephen, I wanted to ask you about the UNESCO World Heritage listing. And obviously that's come through, and normally that kind of thing would be a really welcome development. Why has there been concerns raised this time around for this nomination?
Because the federal government managed to get the conditions applying to the World Heritage listing watered down. Initially, a committee of experts had recommended that the listing be delayed whilst the government ensured that all acidic emissions that could harm the rock art were stopped, that the government stopped all further development and removed existing development and remediated as required. Now, those conditions were incompatible with extending Woodside Energy's Northwest Shelf gas development. The government didn't want to see it happen. And they succeeded through lobbying, which is one thing Australian governments are good at, in convincing member countries in the delegation to support different conditions that effectively allow Woodside's development to go ahead. So it's a great thing that it's on the World Heritage Register. It's a terrible thing that those conditions were watered down. That said, Ebony, the fact that it's on the World Heritage Register creates a very strong formal onus on the government to protect the rock art. So it really should be a springboard for our campaigning, not the end of the affair.
I'm not sure if anyone's got questions so far. Keep your thinking caps on and please come up to the microphone if you can think of any for Stephen. Stephen, I also wanted to ask you about the artists that you took along on that trip. Obviously, it's a cultural place, but it at its heart is rock art. What was some of their reactions to seeing this and the scale and how close industrialization was?
Well, again, I think that they were deeply shocked, the artists who, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with the work of Fiona and Tracy, which is incredible itself. They were deeply shocked by the proximity of the industry to the artwork, and they had the privilege of having Indigenous guidance, but also Ken Mulvaney, who knows the rock art intimately, take us to parts of it that a lot of people wouldn't necessarily see, up gorges that are a bit of a trek to get to, and they were blown away, just blown away. Yeah.
We've got our first question, please.
Thank you. Is this on?
Yes.
Yes. I just wanted to ask, is the issue for the gas development sector as a whole, is it more about this decision, were it rescinded and Woodside not get to go ahead? Is that a tipping point that is trying to be blocked because of the potential for other developments around the world to be blocked, as opposed to the actual financial hit for Woodside when they're saying we won't take a 3% hit or what have you? Does that make sense?
They assert enormous power, and they just take a pretty hard line with government, and Woodside is determined to see this go ahead, and they put huge effort into making it go ahead. Yeah, I think, is it a tipping point? Well, they certainly don't want a view that on climate grounds these things shouldn't go ahead to take off. And they want it to continue. They want it to continue, but I don't know. Yeah, is it yeah, go on. Yeah. If the government had said no to the Northwest Shelf development, yeah, it would have been a strong blow to the broader gas industry, I think. So I'm still thinking that through. Is it a tipping point? I'm not sure, but I get, yeah. I think they'd fight for it anyway, but whether or not it's a tipping point. But what do you think?
Yeah, I was just going to say one of the things that the Australia Institute has raised as part of the Northwest Shelf is the impact that it would have on domestic gas reserves and how much we already kind of export. And the gas fields that Woodside kind of does own are rapidly depleting, and it hasn't really identified where the extra gas that it's supposed to export through this expansion will come from. So I think there are some elements there where this is kind of a stalking horse for massively expanding, for arguing to open new gas fields. Certainly, I think that plays a role.
Yeah, most definitely. To feed this beast, they have to go way offshore and dig deep to get new gas, and so they want the ability to do that. If they can't do that, then the whole export venture is pointless.
And sorry, I'll get to your question in just 1 second. I just think it's important to note too that this is impacting on domestic gas reserves because they're running out of the gas to do it. And so they've applied, and the WA government changed the rules. It used to be that you had to kind of identify the gas that you were going to export, and you could only export kind of offshore gas to the overseas market. But now they've changed the rules so that they can access domestic gas as well. And the Australia Institute actually released research this week showing that overall, Australia's massive gas exports on the East Coast as well as the West Coast are really driving up gas prices overall. So there's this idea that we've got a shortage, which is just absolute rubbish. Australia has a shit ton of gas. We're just exporting it all overseas, and now we're paying global prices for our own gas, and around 80% of Australia's gas gets exported overseas. That's gas that's not available for the manufacturing industry. It's gas that's more expensive for households now. So it is all kind of interlinked in a way that it didn't necessarily used to be. Next question.
Yeah, my question was, is this offshore gas paying any royalties or taxes? Because it seems to me that all of the offshore gas, which is what Woodside is involved with, has not paid any taxes over a long period of years. And basically Woodside is getting a free run against the Australian people.
That's right. The offshore gas is not subject to royalties. The offshore gas in Commonwealth waters is not subject to royalties, unlike on some of the onshore gas over in WA. So that means that the vast majority of the gas in WA doesn't pay royalties. Supposedly, we have the Petroleum Resources Rent Tax, but the PRRT has raised virtually nothing, and it's structured in a way, structured with assistance from representatives of the industry, to ensure that they don't pay, currently pay nothing, but it's been altered slightly so that when they get to 90% of capital costs, they start paying something. But the way they work, the way it's structured, basically, anyway, look, the way it's structured basically means that they pay very, very little tax through the PRRT, and they don't pay royalties. So we're giving the gas away. And this is the problem.
Yeah, there's Treasury documents that more or less say they don't expect
The other thing is it true that we're supplying the offshore gas to Japan, and they are actually supplying that to other countries and making billions of dollars
on selling it,
and we make nothing out of that?
No, but the advantage for Japan, and you think, why would Japan be so keen to have so much of our gas that it has a glut and it can sell it? Well, Japan is part of the gas industrial complex, and so they want other nations in Asia to be buying the equipment that they're developing for the gas industry for gas use. So so when people talk about energy security, Japan's, we need to export gas for Japan's energy security. It's not actually about energy security. It's about the fact that they are lockstep in like a fossil fuel version of the military industrial complex, and re-exporting gas to maintain all those linkages and be able to sell their industrial products that are tied into the gas industry to other gas-using countries.
So basically, we're screwed. Is that what you're saying? We're giving stuff away for nothing. We're being charged enormous amounts from it, and the government's doing nothing.
Yeah, we commissioned an advert, and we've run a campaign with the slogan, "Big Gas is taking the piss." So yeah, we're being screwed. Yes.
Coming and going.
Yeah.
No, you're absolutely right about the royalties and the taxes. I think WA motorists pay about they certainly pay more in motor vehicle registration than the WA government brings in royalties from the gas industry, and those figures are not expected to grow anytime soon. The good news is we don't have to keep getting, robbed as we are. There's things that we can do to change these parameters and the policies that allow this to happen. We just need governments to step in and do something about it. And it could be that state budgets being in more trouble that governments start looking around for ways to raise more revenue, and certainly the gas industry, I would think, would be a prime target. Thanks for your question. We've got one more question there. Oh, two? Yep. We'll come to you first and then you.
Thank you. Thank you for raising attention about this issue in its broader sense and also specifically its impact on Murujuga. I've been lucky enough to go there about 10 years ago, and it was mind-blowing, and share all the sentiments that were expressed in the video. I know there are a lot of elements that are contributing to this specific scenario that we're looking at. And of course, being in Canberra, I have to raise governance because we're a city that often focuses on governance and the public service. But something I've been reflecting on the last couple of years is that it's not necessarily something that the average Australian has a good handle of, like what it should look like, how it should work, what an effective structure is and the purpose. And so I guess my question is, how do we cut through increasing political disengagement that we're seeing across the average population in Australia and around the world, and connect individual level economic and cultural impacts to good governance and impartiality and the separation of, in this instance, we're talking about reports, for example, the importance of having politics separate to solid research.
Do you want to take that one first, Stephen, or do you want me to give it a crack?
I don't have an easy answer for how we achieve that, but I do think it's really, really important. I've been thinking about writing something which is about the way that commissioned reports for government inevitably come up with conclusions that governments want. And it's also interesting to me, I've observed with a few reports, the conclusions often, if you bother to read the report and delve through the tables, the conclusions often don't match the data and material in the report. So it's clearly a politicized process, and it's become like a useful thing. I think there's a quote in Yes Minister about never commission an inquiry without knowing the outcome in advance. And these reports commissioned by government, often from supposed experts, kind of seem to fit that bill. It's inevitable that inevitably they reach conclusions that the government wants them to reach. But yeah, I'm not sure. Ebony might have better ideas. I'm not sure, other than highlighting it, breaking it down, explaining it simply to people and raising awareness. I don't have an easy answer to how we address that, but I think it's a critical issue.
I would agree. And I guess the only thing I would add to that, I also don't have any easy answers, except for that whenever we notice it happen, I think we have to raise hell about it, because it doesn't always happen. There are occasions and policy areas where evidence does lead the policy, but climate change and I think the fossil fuel industry is certainly one egregious area where it's proven not to be the case on the whole. And I think we only allow things to get worse if we just kind of accept that this is what happens and this is how politics is done. I think the only way that we prevent it from getting any worse and from potentially reversing this is if we absolutely raise hell every time we notice it happening, and make it politically painful for governments to engage in this kind of behaviour where they sideline experts and scientists and things like that. It has to be politically painful for them, and the only way to do that is really to engage the public on it.
Richard Dennis has a new Vantage Point essay coming out soon, and I've had an opportunity to read it in advance. And one of the points he makes is that a lot of people cling to the idea of evidence-based policy, but really evidence-based policy is only accepted when power allows it to, and political power drives policy. And one of Richard's sayings, which I think is absolutely spot on, is politicians respond to pain and the threat of pain. So how do we change it so that we don't get corrupted policy that ignores evidence? Well, we have to cause politicians pain by creating enough of a public outcry about what they're doing with the policies they're implementing, that they can't continue to do that. So in the end, it's about confronting power.
Next question.
Hello, I'm Diane Johnson. I've had the privilege to go to Murujuga about 30 years ago, and it was, yes, incredible, along with other places like Gallery Hill, sort of not far away in a sense in WA. I'm just wondering what your connections are with or what connections you've made with the Aboriginal elders, because I'm referring to an article here that was in the Fin Review, and I know I treat the Fin Review with like a bag of salt, but it's talking about the Murujuga Aboriginal Corporation, and I think it's a Peter Hicks, and they're saying that they can work with business, with Woodside, and that they wouldn't let the rock art be destroyed, and they can work with this big business. So I'm just, well, you talked with the Save Our Songlines people, and yes, those Aboriginal or First Nations people, artists who are much further away from that part of the country. Just wondering what your chats with the different Aboriginal people, and then this is probably a case of sort of divide and conquer in a way.
Yeah, I mean, the Murujuga Aboriginal Corporation has been fighting for the listing, and I honour the fact that they have managed to achieve the listing, and I think everyone thinks that that's a very good thing. Now, I don't agree with a conclusion by anyone that Woodside isn't a threat to the rock art. I do believe that there was a desire to have not have anything threaten the heritage listing. And look, it's a difficult situation for Indigenous people dealing with industry in general. And, there are trade-offs. There's a lot of money that goes to sponsoring Indigenous ranges at Murujuga that comes from Woodside Energy. And you can draw your own conclusions about whether contracts for service and what have you, I mean, it just creates a very difficult and vexed situation because we don't have a situation in this country where Indigenous people anywhere can just say no to development on sacred sacred areas. When the Indigenous people from 5 language groups were essentially given, when the Murujuga landscape was created, there was an agreement which barred Indigenous people within that grouping from opposing further industrial development. So that tells you about the power relations between government, industry, and Indigenous people. I don't want to get into anything more. I certainly don't want to criticise anyone, any of the Indigenous people up there who are dealing in a tough environment. But yeah, I don't think it's a fair conclusion I don't think the conclusion that Woodside's activity can happily coexist with the levels of emissions that we've seen with the rock art is one that is supportable on the evidence that I've reviewed.
And I would only just add to that we're absolutely on a unity ticket with the objective of everyone is to preserve the rock art for generations to come. That's fair to say. That unites everyone. Last question, and then I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up.
Yeah, so thank you very much. I'm wondering if, in theory, there's any way we can be proactive in protecting the rock art, say by aerial spraying with very weak alkaline spray, for example. Can we do anything in that way? Thanks.
I'm not sure. It is an intriguing prospect, and I'd have to bow to the opinion of some of the scientific experts about whether that's something that could be considered. But certainly, anything that it could practically be done to diminish the possible threat to the rock art is something worth looking at.
Please thank Stephen Long. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Ebony.
I also want to thank Hannah and Eleanor and any other staff from the Australia Institute who helped here this evening. And a round of applause for Verity Lane Market for hosting us again this month. We love doing politics in the pub here. The bar is still open and dinner is delicious downstairs. If you haven't eaten yet, make sure to grab something to eat or drink before you go. Thanks again for coming out this evening. We really appreciate you attending. Our next Politics in the Pub is on Wednesday, the 20th of August, with Richard Dennis, and he's going to be talking about the new Vantage Point essay that comes out next month that Stephen mentioned. It's called Dead Centre, How Political Pragmatism is Killing Us. It's a ripper of a read, as Stephen says. We're looking forward to it hitting bookshelves. You can pre-order it now at australiainstitute.org.au. It's right there on the front page. Or if you decide to become an annual subscriber, you can save $15 over the 4 issues that we'll release in the year. So we're going to be chatting about that Vantage Point essay. The essay itself will be for sale as well on the evening. So I can't wait for you to join us again in just a few weeks, and you'll have the opportunity to get your copy of the essay signed by Richard after the event as well. Thank you again for coming out this evening and for your interest in this project that is all the other way on the other side of the country, and for helping us make sure that more people know about this, because more people absolutely should and care about it. Thanks again. We'll see you again soon. Thanks.